I will get started. The orders of the day pursuant to Standing Order 1082, Study of Sexual Harassment in the Federal Workplace. We are happy today to welcome by video conference all the way from Brisbane, Australia, Paula McDonald. Paula will speak to us for 10 minutes. Following that, due to the short time that we have because of a vote in the House, we will share the questioning time of 5 minutes for each party. So we will have to be very exact with our time. I don't like to intrude and interrupt all the time, but in this situation I really have to in order to keep us on time and get us back to the House in time for the vote. So I welcome all of you, and especially to Paula McDonald, and tell her you may begin right away, please. And you have a total of 10 minutes.
Okay, hello. I thought I'd begin with a synopsis of my experience in the area of workplace sexual harassment in order to put some parameters around the scope of my work and experience in the area. So I'm a Professor of Employment Relations in the Business School at the Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia. I've held an academic role for the last 10 years, prior to which I had clinical and research roles in the health sector. I've studied the phenomenon of workplace sexual harassment for most of the last 10 years, but most intensely in the last 3 years via an Australian Research Council funded large grant. In this project, my co-investigator, Associate Professor Sarah Charlesworth from the University of South Australia, and I explored a number of what we feel to be important data sets, which comprised in-depth interviews with over 70 expert policy and practitioners from around Australia. We interviewed 30 targets of sexual harassment and talked to each of those for a couple of hours. We've looked at published legal legal decisions over the time. We've analysed around 400 media articles from Australia, the UK, Canada and the US, and the most intensive and we think innovative part of the project involved an analysis of around 300 detailed hard copy files of sexual harassment complaints from all 9 federal, state and territory equal opportunity jurisdictions. And in looking at that data, we saw detailed patterns of the nature of complaints, the characteristics of the people involved, how complaints proceeded through formal alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, and the nature of settlement outcomes, including financial settlements. We have published some of this work, but as you'll appreciate there, the academic pipeline to publishing is a long one, and there is still a lot of work which hasn't quite hit the public realm. Concurrently, while undertaking this research, I've worked closely with the Australian Human Rights Commission in developing 2 successive prevalence surveys on workplace sexual harassment that were administered to a largely representative sample of the Australian population. And these kind of prevalence surveys, particularly over time, are somewhat unusual in the world. I've also written an extensive report for the Australian Human Rights Commission that discusses the critical role of bystanders in preventing and responding to workplace sexual harassment. The committee members are no doubt well aware of the continued prevalence of sexual harassment and its damaging consequences. So in the time I have left, I thought I'd briefly review some of the key findings from our work which really point to the ongoing challenges beyond the prevalence and consequences of sexual harassment. I believe these issues warrant specific further attention in order to redress what's a persistent and pervasive and obviously gendered problem. I can only raise these issues briefly, but there may be some issues that you may want to pick up in terms of further questioning. First, our research showed that and this is very important, that grievance mechanisms in organisations were frequently inadequate. And indeed, many of the complaints we saw that escalated outside of the workplace to commissions were as much related to dissatisfaction with organisational processes as they were to the sexually harassing behaviours per se. Key concerns were around formal and informal channels of reporting, long time frames in responding, issues around vicarious liability and legal risk, line managers who dealt with complaints as an interpersonal issue rather than a legitimate concern that required attention, and reprisals experienced by targets who reported the problem. Second, we've argued for a focus on bystanders in more effectively preventing and responding to sexual harassment. Bystander interventions have been found to be very effective in other areas of violence prevention, including dating and intimate partner violence, and we argue could be potentially adapted to the workplace. Our empirical work in the area showed that sexual harassment has ripple effects that extend well beyond the individual target, in that bystanders, and we defined bystanders broadly, both within and outside the workplace, can and do have active roles in supporting the target and preventing further incidents. However, we also found, unfortunately, substantial evidence of bystanders who could have but who did not act, and worse still, bystanders who joined in with the behaviours, and this had particularly devastating consequences for targets. Third, we've argued that sexual harassment is too often characterised as a sexual advance by one individual, a bad apple, towards another, the victim. In particular, sexual harassment is often thought of as salacious conduct by a male boss towards a female subordinate. And this characterisation, we argue, relegates the problem to the private sphere and identifies it as one that should be principally resolved between one individual and another, while neglecting the fact that some work settings are more oppressively gendered than others. So we've argued that different workplace contexts can shape the perceptions of workers, the conditions and power dynamics that underpin sexual harassment, and also, importantly, non-sexual forms of harassment and discrimination that disadvantage women and some men. So we concur with Margaret Thornton that these more subtle forms of discrimination and harassment may actually reveal more about gendered practices in organisations than the blatant sexualised conduct that's often equated with the high-profile media cases that we read about. Fourth, evidence from details of settlements of sexual harassment complaints in equal opportunity files showed that even within the acknowledged individualised limitations of alternative dispute resolution, or ADR, which is that the process fails to address broader systemic issues that allow sexual harassment, ADR is limited in what it can provide sexual harassment complainants. For example, our data showed that complainants rarely achieved an acknowledgement of wrongdoing and injustice, and that's often what they came to the process seeking primarily. And the process is also limited in providing financial compensation. So our data showed that the mean financial compensation in these cases was around 8,000 Australian dollars. This hadn't changed a lot over time, and in fact this figure is slightly inflated because it also included in some cases statutory employment entitlements, including annual leave. Another important finding from the analysis of complaint files was that only around 1 in 6 complainants remained employed in the organisation where the sexual harassment allegedly took place. So we think that it's possible that the severing of employment relationships is a particularly problematic issue in relation to sexual harassment compared to other forms of discrimination, because it really it's a particularly personal and affronting issue. Nevertheless, the fact that few complainants remained employed in the organisation where the sexual harassment took place is problematic for the conciliation process, because it is an interest-based process in which it's assumed that the parties come to the table with some kind of motivation to restore and repair the relationship at hand. And finally, the essentially privatised nature of the conciliation process works to constrain the ability of both parties. Beg your pardon?
You have 1 minute.
Okay. It constrains the ability of both parties, but particularly the complainant, to come to the table with informed perspectives. And we've argued for a more systematic aggregation and publication of de-identified data so that both complainants and respondents can come to that process with more informed perspectives. So that concludes my opening statement.
Thank you very much, and we'll begin our questioning with Ms. Trupe for a round of 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Paula, for being here today. It's nice to finally have your report with us. It's a very important study that we're doing. Your 2012 article, Encourage, Support, and Act, Bystander Approaches to Sexual Harassment in the Workplace, highlights the importance of the intervention of bystanders in the response to incidents of sexual harassment in the workplace. Two of the reasons you highlight as a reason people do not report incidents of sexual harassment in the workplace are fear of reprisal or the expectation that the response, once the incident is reported, may be inadequate. You also note that this has to do with the difficulty of recognizing the harassing behavior, as harassers do make efforts to keep their behavior from being recognized, making it difficult for bystanders to identify the act and support the victim's claim. What sort of training solutions would you propose to prevent harassment in the first place, and what sort of training solutions would you propose to empower and encourage bystanders to speak out?
Yes, okay, there's there's a lot of issues there. So we've proposed in that report and also subsequently a framework of prevention and response that takes a primary, secondary and tertiary approach. Training is an important part of primary prevention. There's, I think, a need for evaluative research in terms of, objectively analysing the effectiveness of particular training programs. But in our interviews with expert practitioners, they advocated training approaches that were complex in the sense that they used both a carrot and a stick approach. So the stick approach being to inform employees that sexual harassment is illegal and that there will be sort of discipline and punishment for those who perpetrate it. And the carrot approach is a more humanistic approach in training whereby where professional codes of conduct are more at the heart of them, and where people attending training can use scenario-based sort of approaches in order to play out sexual harassment. That trainers use other sort of strategies that our expert practitioners advocated were around making clear that that sexual harassment is not just the sort of typical salacious conduct between a male boss and a female subordinate, but it's a very complex phenomenon that can be perpetrated by either men or women, and particularly men against men as well, which is a common problem. In terms of bystanders, there's very little empirical evidence of the way bystanders behave in workplaces, but in our empirical work, which is currently unpublished but under review, we used a two-dimensional framework which looked at the level of involvement of bystander behaviours and the immediacy of the involvement, and we found that most bystander interventions or bystander actions, because it wasn't just active interventions, it was also providing support to the target, were relatively low level and relatively non-immediate. So a lot of the actions taken, there were a wide variety of actions taken, but they were oftentimes low level and sometimes just based around support. Now, we have to be careful. Sorry,
our time is... How long?
30 seconds left.
20 seconds. What sort of training should be provided to supervisors and management in order to make this possible so that more bystanders are involved and it's a higher level? If you could answer that very quickly, that would be great.
Yeah. From the work that I've done, I would advocate a collective sort of underpinning to a training program, in the sense that people who work together have a collective and collegial responsibility to look after one another, and to understand the subtle gendered processes which often occur in organisations, and these are often covert and not well understood by employees.
Okay, thank you. We'll now move to Ms. Ashton for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much for joining us, Ms. MacDonald. It's a real pleasure, and thank you for the first time that you tried to join us. Our schedule is quite hectic, but we so appreciate your time and the fact that you're sharing such critical work with us as well. I understand that one of the research projects you're working on is called Sexual Harassment in Australia: Causes, Outcomes, and Prevention. I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about the causes of sexual harassment as you've found them.
Okay, the causes of sexual harassment. Well, I think it's important to note that sexual harassment comes in many and varied shapes and forms. And as I've alluded to, there's the typical sexual harassment scenario that we often read about in the media, and which employees understand is this salacious conduct between a boss and a subordinate. But, it comes in various manifestations, and the behaviours range from sexual assault, which of course is a criminal offence, right through to very subtle language that permeates organisations. So, and I think these more subtle forms of gendered organisational processes are almost the most problematic in terms of causing sexual harassment, because they're not widely recognised. The other issue is that in our research we found that a lot of sexual harassers are serial offenders, and that because organisational processes don't adequately deal with those harassers, they're often I'm not sure if it's a Canadian term, but these men are often Teflon coated, so they're often not disciplined as a consequence of their behaviour, and so they're given licence to continue to treat women in very demoralising kinds of ways.
Ms. McDonald, I'm wondering if in your research you found that the causes vary by workplace or across different industries, or in whether it's the private sector or the public sector. Have you seen any difference there?
No great differences, and I think that's actually been an important finding of our research. I mean, it's still the case that particularly male-on-male sexual harassment is often a problem in male-dominated workplaces, and particularly blue-collar male-dominated workplaces. But really, I think it's important to note that sexual harassment is widespread across a whole range of different workplaces, and it's apart from blue-collar male-dominated organisations. I mean, having said that, the mining industry in Australia has really got it. It's a blue-collar male-dominated organisation, but it seems to have really got its act together in terms of adequately preventing the problem. So it's not so much about whether the organisations are public sector, private sector, male-dominated, female-dominated, gender-balanced, or even the industry that they occur in. It's often about the particular context of not even so much an entire organisation, but the particular context of that work group, or that sort of milieu, or I hesitate to use the word culture, but the kind of at the department level, the ways, the practices that are embedded in work systems which allow sexual harassment to flourish. I think that's more important than that, or that seems to be more a problem than necessarily divisions between public, private, small, large, male-dominated, female-dominated.
I have 30 seconds left.
Great. And just one quick question. You've argued for systemic aggregation of de-identified data around all forms of discrimination, including sexual harassment. Can you inform us why the collection of such data is so important? Quickly. Thank you.
Yeah. The collection of that data is very important, particularly for complainants, because complainants often come to the conciliation or ADR process with absolutely no idea of what to expect, of how much financial compensation to seek, what kind of other non-financial settlement outcomes might be possible. And so it's in order to inform the perspectives of both complainants and respondents, but particularly complainants, because they often have less power in the processes that ensue.
Okay, thank you, and we'll now move on to Ms. Squirrel for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here, Ms. McDonald. I have to try to be very straight with my questions because the clock is ticking for all of us. Much of what we have heard in relation to some of the particular departments we've been dealing with has more to do with the whole culture of an organization. And I think just changing the person who's at the head of a very large organization that sends a message down that any kind of harassment or the subtle remarks and the kinds of things that go on would not be tolerated. Is that enough that would shake up a whole organization to change their attitude in an organization that's predominantly male?
Leadership is absolutely important. Those messages that sexual harassment won't be tolerated do need to come from the highest levels of any organisation. However, I think a really important and missing piece of the puzzle in terms of that leadership is that leaders need to create practices in organisations that deal adequately with sexual harassment after it's already occurred. So, yes, primary prevention is important, but secondary prevention is really where a lot of organisations are falling down, and our work has really shown this very clearly. And so those, the way investigations take place, the timeliness of responses to complaints of sexual harassment are incredibly important, not only for the individuals involved, but the way that those complaints are dealt with send clear messages to everybody in the organisation that the organisation and the leadership team are competent in dealing with discrimination in all of its forms, and that the problem won't be tolerated.
We heard from one of our professors last week at our meeting that had done a lot of work, again, similar to yourself, Ms. MacDonald, on the issue. And the professor had pointed out that, especially where there's a male-dominated culture that a female is working in, that the pushback often comes because of concern for their own jobs as males. They've got a female now working beside them in a similar capacity, and that generally the women tend to be assertive and outspoken, and that men feel threatened by that. So the consequence are a variety of harassment techniques are often used on the women. What are your comments on that?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I would agree again that male-dominated organisations can be like that, but oftentimes female-dominated organisations have a concentration of men at the top as well, and so this kind of issue can be a problem in those organisations as well. But I also want to say that it's important to note that a lot of sexual harassment is not perpetrated. In fact, more than 50% in the Australian Human Rights Commission prevalence survey, more than 50% of sexual harassment reported is by co-workers, not by people in more senior organisational positions. And I think that probably needs to be more widely understood, because it's a different kind of phenomenon. But even men and women who work together at the same level, if from a feminist or gendered perspective, I mean, men often hold the cards in organisations, even if they're working at the same hierarchical level. So this is what I mean. It's important to understand sexual harassment as a multifaceted and complex phenomenon that I think if those kind of nuances are better understood, it would allow targets to firstly name sexual harassment more frequently and more appropriately, and also to come forward and report it more often, because that's obviously another problem is reporting levels are very low, around 1 in 5 actually.
Okay, thank you very much. Any last comments that you'd like to make, Ms. MacDonald? Like about 20 seconds. I'll let you add anything that you think the committee should know.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Paula, for being with us today and giving us such worthwhile words of advice. We hate to be rushing like this, but that's just the way it is here when we were called for a vote.
No problem. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. And any other questions or nothing? Okay. I'll call for adjournment.